Hello everyone, I'm Lori Torrini. Welcome to this comprehensive horse property management plan. It is going to go over just the part of our ranch that houses my Arabian horses, and it's located in Yoder, Colorado in the United States. A little bit of background that you're going to need to know before we get started with the details is that I'm your presenter. I'm Lori Torrini. I'm a certified professional animal trainer and behaviorist. I am certified through Fear Free, and that is in their trainer, their veterinary, equine, and shelter programs. I have an Associate of Applied Science degree in zookeeping, a Bachelor of Science degree in animal health and behavior. I'm currently the Director of Behavioral Husbandry at Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. I also manage their veterinary and nutrition plans for all of the animals on site, not just the horses. Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary currently houses 12 cats, 15 dogs, 42 horses, and 145 snakes. We have cared for many other species over the years that include pigs, ducks, chickens, guinea pigs, ferrets, mice, rats, gerbils, turtles, salamanders, rabbits, donkeys, parrots, other birds, llamas, goats, sheep, fish, frogs, and chinchillas, and I'm sure I'm probably forgetting something. I want to emphasize that the overview we're going through today is just for the horse portion of the facility. We aren't going to be talking about the portions of the facility that house these other species. And just for learning purposes and to keep things simple, I am just going to assume the only horses here are my 19 Arabian and half Arabian horses that belong to me. We aren't going to be addressing the other horses at the facility. The ranch is 35.1 acres and it's located 30 miles east of Colorado Springs, Colorado. It is in what's known as a short grass prairie ecosystem. It's semi-arid with grazing tolerant and drought resistant grasses that naturally grow. It's very non-hospitable to trees and shrubs growing. There's a lack of moisture. We have frequent wildfires. And the common species that we have around here tend to be pronghorn antelope, coyotes, prairie dogs, rattlesnakes, birds, and insects. On good years, when we have water, we do get amphibians. We get a lot of frogs, salamanders, things like that. We have an intermittent pond on the property. I hesitate to call it seasonal because we don't have it every season. It's only here during the years when it's wet enough to accumulate water. The summers here are very hot and the winters are very cold. This is an aerial view of the property. So you can see in the upper left, that's where we have most of the structures grouped. And then the rest of the property is pretty much open space for the use of the horses. So our infrastructure includes a 36 by 36 foot barn, and that houses 3 stalls with connected runs. So the horses are not confined to stalls. They can go outside whenever they want. It also has a 12 by 12 feed room and a 12 by 12 tack room, and then a 12 by 12 area that we use for storage. We use for our feral cat colony or our barn cats, and sometimes we use it for grooming. We have 13 loafing sheds of various sizes located around the property. We have a hay barn. We have 3 corrals, and those are what I'm defining as areas that are 1/4 of an acre to an acre large, that are dry lots, but they're used for horses to exercise in and be able to get turned out in and roll and socialize with conspecifics and do natural behaviors. We have 4 pastures, and those are what I'm defining as areas that naturally grow the grass. And those range in size from a 1/4 acre all the way up to 14 acres. And then we have numerous runs, holding pens, and paddocks. And that's what you see here in this photo is one of our pipe paddocks. This is that aerial view that I showed you before, but the pasture areas, and that's what I'm defining as areas that naturally grow grass. They're not dry lots. They have some natural grasses growing, although not enough to sustain the horses. We'll talk about that later, but these are pastures. So we have a 4-acre pasture with 1 loafing shed, a 14-acre pasture with 3 loafing sheds. Those are circled in plum. We have that 1/4 acre pasture with 1 loafing shed that we turn 2 to 3 horses out in at a time, and that is not every day. That's just sort of an auxiliary spot. Then we have another 14-acre pasture with 4 loafing sheds, and we do have the upper left-hand corner of that pasture sectioned off into a 1-acre corral, but we leave that open most of the time, but we have the ability to close that off if we need to, and that has a loafing shed in it. In the upper left of this picture is where we have our other animal buildings for the reptiles, the dogs, the cats, any other species that we bring in. And then that's where our barn is, and some of our larger corrals, paddocks, runs, some of our other loafing sheds, and we have a riding arena there that doubles as a corral. In the lower portion of the picture, you can see that natural seasonal pond, but it only fills up when we're in a non-drought year. It's not full of water every single year. It's very intermittent. So let's talk first about establishing good barn hygiene. We really emphasize good nutrition here and good veterinary care. And after that, we want to make sure that everything is hygienic, that it's clean and disinfected, because that establishes good health. So I just mentioned a couple things that make barn hygiene very important. It prevents the spread of disease among horses, because if you have a hygienic barn, you are keeping bacteria, viruses, and parasites, also molds and funguses, out as much as possible. You're going to reduce the presence of pests and insect disease vectors. Mainly what we see here are flies and mosquitoes. We're going to try to ensure a safe and clean environment for the horses and the handlers and any other animals that use the barn. And so that's going to reduce injuries. And of course, keeping things clean, we already talked about, prevents pathogens. It enhances the overall health and well-being of everybody that uses the barn, not just in the ways we've already discussed, but also it's going to reduce odors and debris in general. And so if you're sitting in the barn, if you're an animal walking in the barn, if you're using this space, you don't want to constantly come into contact with dirt and debris. You don't want to constantly smell odors that are unpleasant to you or foul to you. So a good hygienic barn keeps those things reduced as well. I want you to note that cleaning and disinfecting are two different things. You have to clean first before you disinfect. So cleaning is the removal of dirt and debris. I can simply clean something by brushing it off with my hand. I'm brushing the dirt off. Think of brushing the dirt off the bottom of your shoe. So you're just removing dirt and debris from things. You can do this with your hand. You can do it with water alone. You can do it with soap and water. You can scrub with your hands, with brushes, with towels. It's literally just removing debris from items. If you don't remove the debris, the disinfectants cannot reach the things that they are meant to kill. So let's talk about disinfecting. Disinfecting removes pathogens. That's things like viruses, bacteria, fungi, molds, parasites, and other things that cause disease. Disinfectants are chemicals that are specifically designed to kill a certain percentage of pathogens. So you need to read the label and see whatever disinfectant you're using, what it is meant to kill, what percentage of the amount of those pathogens on a surface that it is meant to kill. You need to follow the instructions for efficacy, including the contact time. That means the amount of time the chemical has to be in contact with the surface to kill the pathogens before you wash it off. If you don't remove the dirt and debris first, the chemical disinfectant cannot get to the pathogens. So you have to clean first, then disinfect. We do daily cleaning of certain things. We remove manure and soiled bedding daily from the stalls that are in use, and not all of our horses are in stalls. We clean and we refill water buckets every day. That means dumping the old water out, scrubbing it out, and then refilling it. We clean the water buckets daily. We don't disinfect them every day. So we clean them daily. We clean out feeders. That means dumping over the grain feeders, the hay feeders, just getting the debris out before we feed again. We sweep the aisles and common areas, and when we have time, we brush the horses and clean their hooves daily. So this is a daily cleaning routine. We're cleaning dirt and debris off of things. Deep cleaning is going to be what involves disinfecting and things like that. So we're going to strip the stalls weekly of all bedding and disinfect them and then put new bedding in. Monthly, we're going to clean and disinfect the entire barn. we're going to scrape out the runs, paddocks, and corrals. So we take the backhoe and we scrape out the surface of those areas, and we move any manure and debris to a manure pile. And then quarterly, we're going to look at removing things like old unused cobwebs. We're not going to remove cobwebs spiders are actively living on and using. We want those to help with control of flies and other pests, but any unused cobwebs we're going to remove. Ventilation is also highly important on the property in general, but especially anywhere indoors, in loafing sheds and barns. So you see that loafing shed in this picture's got windows in it, and those can be opened and closed as needed. The front is open right now, but it also has a door that can be closed in inclement weather. We hardly ever close windows and doors here. We leave them open almost all of the time, except in very extreme weather. So these things ensure proper airflow, reduce humidity, and ammonia buildup. We use the open windows and doors when weather permits, which is pretty much all the time. And if needed, for some reason we have to close up the barn and it's getting stagnant in there, we can hook up fans and use those. This is what the barn interior looks like. If you look at the diagram, the red part in the middle, that is a roof cupola, that's the square, and then eave vents running horizontally from either side of the cupola. The lime green are the aisle doors, and those both open into large outdoor barnyards. And then on the south side of the barn, where the 12 by 12 box stalls are, each of those has a Dutch door that opens out into a run, and each of those runs opens up into a corral that's about a ½ acre. And then on the north side of the barn, we don't have any windows or doors because that's where the wind comes from. We do have a large ½ acre corral on that side of the barn, and it is bordered on the north by a long run-in shed. And by long run-in shed, I think it's 60 feet long and 12 feet deep. So the horses that use that corral can just walk in and out of that shed whenever they want to. The wind here blows from the north, kind of from the northwest, but mostly from the north. So most of our buildings and windows are open facing south. Waste management's important. We don't want waste building up, whether that's trash or manure. So a manure management plan is really important. We want to regularly remove manure to maintain cleanliness in the barn and the paddocks and the runs. We compost that in some piles, which means that it gets broken down and we can later use that as fertilizer for the fields. And then some of it gets hauled away. We just want to make sure the manure is not anywhere where it can get around food or water. So if you look at this horse in the picture, this is Cheyenne, one of my Arabian fillies. She's 10 years old now. She's in one of the runs. So there's water right there. It's obviously dirt because it's a run. It's not growing grass, but there's grass growing on the outside, and she's eating that. So we wouldn't want manure to build up right here around where she's picking grass from underneath the corral panel, where we might throw hay down, or where that water is. As far as trash, we empty that daily, and we have a large dumpster that collects all of our trash for the property. And then as far as medical waste, we have a sharps container for needles. We have a biohazard bin, which we have special biohazard bags that the biohazards go in, and then it goes into a bin, and then we dispose of that at our veterinarian. Maintenance. So we regularly clean and disinfect the facilities, but the tools you use to do that also need to be regularly cleaned and disinfected. And that could be shovels, manure rakes, wheelbarrows, manure carts, anything like that. And then we want to store those tools properly to prevent them from getting damaged or contaminated. We want to make sure that structural repairs on the barn are kept up with. So as we're cleaning, as we're feeding horses, as we're taking care of things in general, we want to fix anything that we notice out of place, damaged, or broken. So replace or repair broken tools and appliances. Basically, if something is broken, fix it. If something's dirty, clean it. Barn hygiene affects air quality. So you can imagine if you had moldy hay, if you had moldy ground surfaces, if you had moldy wood, if you had old feed, if you had lots of manure building up, attracting insects and other critters like parasites or critters that you don't want in your barn that could carry diseases like prairie dogs, etc., then that's not going to be good. So you want to make sure that you keep everything cleaned up, because that is going to make for better air quality in general. So how do we know if the air quality is good? Well, I have an air quality indicator on my phone that will tell me what the general air quality is in our area. And then we also want to monitor ammonia levels, dust, and humidity in the barn and other buildings, especially the hay shed. And so you can buy small devices that do that. This is what one looks like right here, and it'll tell you the temperature, the humidity. You can get ones that will also tell you ammonia levels. It just depends on what you're looking to read on the indicator and how much you want to spend. So there are also air quality sensors you can get. Think of a carbon monoxide detector that goes off if the carbon monoxide in your home gets too high. You can get sensors like that for your barns and set it to alert you if certain chemicals become too high. Ammonia control is going to be accomplished in several ways. One is monitoring, but also you want to frequently remove urine-soaked bedding. You want to frequently make sure that you're cleaning any concrete surfaces that horses urinate on, any stall mats that horses urinate on. If they spray urine on any wood, you want to make sure that all that is cleaned off, because the urine is primarily what's going to produce the ammonia in the air. So frequent removal of urine-soaked bedding, use absorbent bedding materials, and then just clean the stalls, mats, and concretes if urine gets on them. You want to make sure you're reducing dust, and on particularly dry days, dry months, dry years, which we have sometimes whole entire years that are extremely dry, we can wet down surfaces, wet down concrete, wet down stalls, wet down the hay, wet down paddocks, wet down runs. On this picture, it was a day where we got rain and we didn't have to do that. Now, you don't want these areas flooded, but out here where we live, a day like this looks pretty wet, and I guarantee the next day you're going to barely be able to tell that it rained because our ground is so dry. So you can also use low dust feeds and bedding. Sometimes nature helps, like it did on this day, and you see them eating the hay off the ground. We didn't soak that hay, but it's fresh hay that we threw out. They're eating it right away. What you don't want to do is throw hay out, have the hay get rained on, have manure get on it, have the horses roll in it or step in it, and then have them eating it. Ventilation systems, well, our barns face away from the wind, so the wind is not blowing debris, dust, and any air pollutants into the barn. We have the openings facing south, and we have openings on the east and west. So ventilation comes from three sides. And so by strategically placing the doors and windows, we can keep airflow moving through that barn if all those doors and windows are open. And we generally do that most of the year, even in winter. If the weather's extreme and we have to close everything up, we have portable fans that we can use to help maintain airflow during the times when the barn has to be closed. We want to regularly monitor lots of stuff. We want to do regular maintenance checks of not only the facility, but the ventilation systems. Are the windows and doors working properly? Will they close properly if we have to? Are any fans that we use working properly? You want to check cords and things if you're plugging stuff in so that you don't have additional fire hazards. You want to monitor the horses themselves for any signs of respiratory distress or illness. And basically, again, I will reiterate, if it's dirty or dusty, clean it. If it's broken, repair it. If it's sick, call the vet. Education and training of staff, volunteers, board members, in our case, anybody that's going to be out at the facility interacting with the facility itself or interacting with the animals needs to be trained. So we train them on the importance of good air quality, how to implement best practices for maintaining good air quality, and we also train the staff how to recognize the other issues I've mentioned, like maintenance and cleanliness in general, illness and disease in the horses, any injuries, etc. Any damage to fences, barns, loafing sheds, anything that needs to be addressed, we want people letting us know. All right, let's talk about the horses. I mentioned that Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary has 42 horses. I'm just going to specifically, for the purposes of this overview, talk about the Arabian and half Arabian horses that we have at the sanctuary, which are predominantly mine. So there are 5 Arabian mares, there are 7 half Arabian mares, and there are 7 Arabian geldings. We don't have any half Arabian geldings at this time. And all of these Arabs and half Arabs are 10 to 34 years old. So the gray one that's pictured here looking at the text that says the horses, that's my mare, Sassy Lady. She's 34 years old this year. And this is how I have those Arabian herds grouped. And this grouping is based on their social structure, how they get along with each other, how long they've been together, if they arrived here already knowing each other, if they're related, etc. So Sujil's group is 5 geldings. Mina's group is comprised of 5 Arabian and half Arabians, 1 gelding, and 4 mares. Fazer's group, again, is a mix of mares and I guess he's the only gelding, and the rest are half Arabian or Arabian mares. And then Summer and Lucy are unrestricted diets. They're unrestricted mobility plans. They have a lot going on, and so they don't go out to pastures. They're in some of those paddocks that you saw in other pictures near the barn. So each of them has their own space where they are free to move around, and they can have the food that they're supposed to have with the limited exercise they're allowed to have and still have shelter. So let's talk about implementing practices to reduce grazing pressure and improve pasture quality. This is a good year pictured. This is several years ago because this horse Rapture, he has passed away. So I want to say this was about 3 years ago that this photo was taken. We also still had pigs at the time. Rapture passed away at age 39 and a half. My last pig passed away at age 19. And so this was the pig pen and one of the pastures, and you can see that it's got some pretty decent growth. That's not what it looks like most years. This is also one of the Arabians that's passed away. This was Rocky. He died at around age 36. And so rotational grazing is something where you put horses out on the pastures where they can graze for a period of time. And then you want to give the pastures, this grassy area, a rest. So then you move the horses into dry lots or paddocks, which you see in the background here where the portable corral panels are. So you can see where the grass ends and the dirt begins. That's an example of you've got this pasture that horses can graze, but you don't want to leave them on it all the time or it's going to look like that dry lot. That brings us to pasture rest periods, which you want to implement based on the grass growth stages. And you want to ensure that you're moving these horses into dry lots or paddocks or sacrifice areas, which might just be a huge pasture that you don't care about. It might be completely dirt, like this one you see in the middle. In the foreground, we've got foliage, vegetation growing, and then we have this sacrifice area that you see Libby in, one of my Arabs. So by doing that, you're keeping some of the grassy areas viable for grazing and you're just sacrificing others. That still gives the horses an area to display their species typical behaviors like running, like rolling, like resting, like moving around, like interacting with conspecifics. Stocking density is something you have to keep in mind if you are going to graze pastures. So you want to maintain an appropriate number of horses for the size of the pasture. If the horses are eating the grass and you expect that to be their nutrition, the rule of thumb is about 1.5 to 2 acres of grazing per horse. So for instance, in a 14-acre pasture, you would want to graze no more than about 7 or 8 horses if you expect that pasture to subsist and continue to grow grass. If it's a sacrifice area and you don't care about it, you're just using it for exercise, a 14-acre pasture could accommodate about 14 horses, or if you go down to a ½ acre per horse per exercise, it could accommodate even more than that for exercise, for moving around, for interacting with other horses. So you want to adjust that based on the pasture conditions and the horse's needs. Our pasture conditions are typically not good for grazing, so we supplement with hay. Let's discuss pasture use. This map is that same aerial map, and I have the pastures, the areas that actually grow grass outlined in plum. So you can see that there is a 2 14-acre pastures, there is a 4-acre pasture, and then there's that 1/4 acre pasture. And so the herds can be rotated around the 2 14-acre pastures and the 4-acre pasture, with occasional time with 2 horses spent in the 1/4 acre pasture, and then those herds can also be rotated out into the 1 acre and 1/2 acre corrals to give these pastures a rest if we were depending on these pastures for continuous nutrition, which we don't. We do supplemental feeding. So this is what our pastures look like most of the time, because usually we're in a drought. Most of our years are drought years, and there's just not vegetation growing. So our horses don't rely on pasture for nutrition. We give them hay twice a day in feeders like this, and then we scatter hay throughout the day out in the fields. Even in those 14-acre pastures, we drive it out, we throw it off the truck, so it's just scattered all over the field. So they still have to move around throughout the day to graze on that hay that's provided. If necessary, we also provide pelleted feed, such as complete feeds or compressed alfalfa pellets that we soak. So even in wet years with some pasture for grazing, we are supplementing with hay and other feeds. So if, and that's a big if, we could grow and graze our pastures, what are things that we would need? Well, we would first need to do soil testing and then look at how to fertilize those soils. So regular soil testing is going to monitor the nutrient levels, monitor the nutrients that we start out with, and then monitor those nutrient levels after we've applied fertilizer to the soils. Colorado State University Extension Services can do that for us. And then we are going to need to renovate pastures that haven't been planted, seeded, fertilized before. So we have to reseed the pastures with an appropriate forage species that's going to grow in our climate. And then we want to use no-till methods to preserve soil structure and prevent erosion. We would have to irrigate. Absolutely, we would have to have a water supply for irrigation. We would have to obtain water rights and get appropriate permits to irrigate. And then we would have to have the equipment to irrigate the fields and pastures. And this is whether we're growing pastures for grazing or to produce hay. We would need to make sure that we are controlling weeds, because we would be planting and seeding and irrigating and making sure the pasture soil had good nutrients. You're also going to get weeds that take advantage of that. And so we would want to mow regularly, know how to remove just weeds and not the grasses that we want to grow. And that might entail herbicides that will kill weeds but not grasses. And again, Colorado Extension Services could help us with that if that was something that we were going to be doing. So managing nutrient gains on pastures, let's talk a little bit about that. Now, this is a typical pasture in not a drought year, but not a really wet year. This is what the short grass prairie tends to look like. It's short grasses, it's flat prairie, there are no trees and shrubs. This is what you get. So soil testing, again, we have to test the soil to determine what nutrients are already present, choose forage types that would grow in it, and then use fertilizers, if applicable, that are going to grow the types of grasses we want in the soil that we have. So we want to avoid nutrient runoff and leaching. What that means is we would want to make sure that if we are irrigating or if we're getting rain, that water is not making the nutrients and seeds leach too deep into the soil where they can't grow grass, or running off the soil completely into water basins or ditches or lakes. We want to keep the nutrients and the seeds and the grass where it's supposed to be. And part of that is going to be planting proper foliage types that are going to thrive in our environment. And we want to look at what's going to grow here, and also what is at the same time appropriate for the horses nutritionally. We don't want to plant something that doesn't have nutrient value to the horses. And then we want to develop a plan to balance the nutrient inputs and outputs. So how do we balance the fertilizer, the nutrients going into the soil with the grass growth and the horses grazing? And then we want to make sure that the grass growing isn't too rich that it causes the horses health issues. We usually don't have that issue here in Colorado on the plains, but in areas of the country where grass grows easily, where you have high moisture and high nutrient content, horses can sometimes become sick or ill or laminitic because the grass is actually too rich and nutrient dense. And then again, we want to make sure we're preventing the nutrient runoff and leaching into the soil instead of growing above ground and being eaten by the horses. Cover crops are something we would have to consider, and that's going to improve soil health and nutrient retention. So those are going to be crops that the horses don't necessarily eat, and it's going to help maintain the soil integrity. We want to select species that are suitable for the local climate and soil conditions. Our soil is very sandy and it has a lot of clay in it. And then we also want to consider crops as vegetative buffers. So those are things you plant that the horses aren't going to eat that are going to help you with erosion control, flooding damage, and then it's going to filter runoff so that contaminants don't end up in drinking water supplies. It's going to act as like natural water filters as the water runs through the vegetative buffers. That might filter out things like manure, for example. All right, we want to adjust the grazing patterns to prevent nutrient depletion. So again, that might mean rotating horses to different areas. And we want to keep the manure cleaned up and away from water sources. Now this photo is from the winter. We're not getting growth right now. We still don't want the horses eating down the old grass and pulling the roots up if we plan to grow these pastures in the spring and summer. We also just want to make sure, again, that we're keeping manure cleaned up so that it doesn't run into water sources. Manure management's important. This is one of our corrals. This is a half-acre corral, and this is that long run-in shed that I told you about. So we want to prevent the manure from contaminating water sources, whether it's the water we give them in water troughs or whether it's water that's going to run into the natural pond that I mentioned. And we also want to prevent manure from ending up in areas where there's any standing water. So we want to prevent stagnant standing water, especially manure in that stagnant standing water. That's going to definitely attract things like mosquitoes. So we want to compost the manure if we're going to apply it to pastures. That means you let it sit out for a long time. It chemically goes through some changes that make it appropriate to fertilize pastures with. If we're not composting the manure for use, we want to haul that away. And we want to keep our manure piles away from places where that manure can get blown into or run into with water, food or water sources, or where the horses would be standing in it. Let's talk about managing water flow a little bit more. So we use the natural topography of the land here on our ranch. So basically the structures are all on the high ground and the water here flows southwest or down from the structures. And then it naturally collects in that pond I mentioned. And then we can assist as needed a little bit with our skid loader by scraping areas or digging some small ditches. But we have to do minor adjustments only because otherwise we would need permits. We would need surface water permits and all kinds of permits anytime we're messing with groundwater or surface water. So we're relying mostly on the natural topography of our property and where the structures are built on the high ground and the water naturally runs away from it. This is what that looks like. So all of our structures are kind of grouped up in the upper left, and even these structures that are a little bit lower, even on the wettest years where we've had flooding, where we've had this natural pond be up to 4 feet deep, none of these loafing sheds have been underwater. None of the loafing sheds have flooded. So none of the areas where you see structures flooded, even during those very wet years. Now we've had part of the pastures flood, like that 4-acre pasture, part of that flooded, but not where the loafing shed is. We had this pond overflow and it stayed below where that for this loafing shed is. And then the upper right pasture didn't flood at all. So our property is pretty well structured that even on years where we have flooding, 2014 we had a huge flood, none of our structures flooded. It all flowed down into this pond, and the pond did overflow, but it didn't reach any of our structures. So if we were going to use non-natural plans for water flow, that means things that we're going to mechanically do to the ground or install, we're going to have to get permits. So some of those things might look like this. Buffer zones. We would maybe establish buffer zones with native vegetation along waterways, and that's going to normally include digging ditches, planting, and then irrigating those areas, and then reducing runoff to filter the contaminants and manure and anything like that that I talked about before is usually going to be done again with vegetative buffers, but we can also install artificial drains. That stuff's all going to need permits, and we would need equipment to do that. So diverting water, it's the same thing. If we start using swales and berms to direct water flow, or we install any artificial drains or ditches, we need permits for that. But those things will prevent erosion and protect water quality. This is the lake we had in 2014. And you see that's the loafing shed there, that's the furthest away. And it did not flood, but the water came pretty close to it. And it did bury the fence that divides our property from the neighbors. So the pond did overflow some, but it didn't flood any of our structures. And you can see this high ground, there is a little bit of water on it. I mean, it's soggy, but there's no standing water there. It's all flowing down into that lake. We're just lucky that we can use the natural topography of the land and not have to worry about some of these artificial things to manage the water flow. If we wanted to harvest rainwater, so this is a particularly wet day and a particularly wet year. If we wanted to collect this rainwater and not just let it fall on the ground, as you see, we would need permits for that. We would have to pay money for that, and we would have to use specific equipment for that. In order to manipulate the flow of the fallen water towards natural or artificial holding ponds, we would also need permits. I already mentioned to collect and store the rainwater for irrigation, we need permits. And so it would be good because it would reduce the reliance on groundwater. That's the water we get from our well, and it would protect that well water a little bit, but we just can't in Colorado collect rainwater unless we have special permission. It's just the way it is here. So sediment control. Sediment is like dirt and any solid debris that could flow when water's flowing. And so we could use silt fences and sediment basins, and that's something that has to be constructed. And so if we were renovating the property in some way, that's something we'd have to do artificially. Planting vegetative buffers is a little bit easier. And here's an example of a natural vegetative buffer. You've got some weeds here along this drive, and it is keeping this water back. So there is a little low area here that collects water off this drive, and those vegetative buffers are going to help filter that water that goes into that holding area, although the domestic animals are not drinking out of that. And it's also going to keep it from eroding the drive because it's sort of keeping this little holding pond contained. You're going to prevent sediment from entering streams and waterways if you have these buffers around any areas that are collecting water. Number one, it's going to slow the flow of water out of these areas, and it's going to filter water that does leach out of these areas. And then we could install drains if we needed to and make the water go wherever we wanted it to. But again, that's going to require equipment, mechanical means, and permits. So this is an example of one of our pastures and a low area between a sacrifice area and the pasture. So we want to avoid, if we were using fertilizers or if we're spreading manure, we're going to avoid applying those fertilizers or manure near this water or up from this water, meaning we don't want to put those fertilizers or manure on the side of this water that's going to make it flood down into this water pool or into the field. We want to make sure that any manure and fertilizers is going exactly where we want it to and not where the water is accidentally carrying it. We can also look at using slow release fertilizers to minimize runoff. So let's say where these miniature horses are standing, we were going to fertilize this and plant it. And obviously water flows through this space and down into that holding area. So you wouldn't want that water that's flowing through here to wash away your seeds or fertilizer. So if you use slow release fertilizer, then it's not all going to get washed away at once. We want to regularly monitor the water quality, and that's if the horses are drinking it or if we're using it for irrigation. And then we want to adjust our management practices based on what we find from those tests. Are there chemicals in the water? Is there manure in the water? Is there too much unhealthy sediment or debris in the water? And then we're going to have equipment to manage the land and maintain water control devices in good working order. Water control devices like things that are irrigating, drains, any ditches that we make with pipe or artificial concrete, anything like that, you're going to have to maintain. All right, let's talk about one of my favorite subjects, deliberate fencing. I like fencing, and there's several benefits to having fencing. Let's get into those. So there are several fencing types. There's wood, electric, straight wire. There is barbed wire, but not recommended for use with horses. So I'm just talking about fences that are generally considered safe to use with horses. Anti-climb mesh, vinyl fence, pipe, PVC, high tensile polymer fencing, cord fence. Usually the cord fence, it looks like rope, but it's a cord, a high tensile cord, and usually there is electric running through that. There are flex fences that look like a big band or like a belt that's stretched out, portable corral panels, and stone. You don't hear too much about stone, especially not in the United States. You see this a lot in Europe, but I thought I'd share this photo of an example of a stone wall fence next to what could be a wood fence, but I think it is the flex fence. So some horses might jump over this, some horses wouldn't. And that's where you have to know your horses and what type of fence is appropriate for their personalities, their size, etc., their behavior. Because this stone fence might be perfectly fine for some horses. I have horses that would jump over this without a second thought. Perimeter fencing is the fencing that you're going to put around your entire property, around the perimeter of your property, whether or not horses and other animals come into contact with that. So that's going to border your other properties that aren't yours, your neighboring properties. It's going to border the roads. Perimeter fencing is a good idea. You want to install something that's durable, safe, prevent horses from escaping, keep other livestock out. In Colorado, we do not legally have to keep our livestock on our property. We could let them free roam. If you don't want someone else's livestock on your property, you have to fence them out. And then protect the property from trespassers. So nobody could just drive in or walk in, depending on what type of perimeter fencing you have. Paddock fencing, and by paddock I mean runs, corrals, pens, small spaces that aren't a 14-acre or 2-acre or 5 or 6 acre pasture, small spaces. You want to use safe materials like vinyl or pipe for these internal paddocks. That's because the smaller the area, the easier it is for the horses to get into a scuffle and get hurt. So you're not going to want to use fencing types like wire because horses can typically get hurt easier on that. So you wouldn't want to use that for a small space. What's pictured here is steel pipe. I really love this. It's very expensive. If I had my way, our whole property would be fenced with this. You want to ensure the fencing is visible to horses to prevent them from accidentally running into it if they can't see it. If you have blind horses or horses with visual impairments, you definitely want something like this so that they can feel it, touch it, come into contact with it, and aren't going to get hurt on it. We have housed blind horses in our sanctuary. This pipe works great, but you can also use other smooth fencing like the vinyl fencing, like the banded fencing. If a horse can't see, they're going to come in contact with the fence and you don't want them to get injured on it. You want to be cognizant of how you're stocking these small areas. So you might be able to put several horses in a small area if their social dynamics warrant it. You also want to consider the horse's size. So this area right here, I'm trying to think, it's 36 feet wide by 60 feet long. And this is one of the runs off the stalls. I have 5 mares that get along exceptionally well. They all eat in this space together, and in bad weather, all 5 of those mares will cram into that 12 by 12 stall. Not because I'm putting them in there, but because that's what they choose to do. You could have 2 horses that didn't get along, and this space would not be big enough. So you've really got to look at the social dynamics of, if you're going to contain horses in a small space, who you put in there. So if you're doing rotational grazing and you're changing up your pasture layout periodically, portable corral panels are the way to go, or electric fencing. And that means that, okay, right now this is our sacrifice area. They've eaten it down. We want to let this area grow up maybe over the next year or two. So we're going to take all these corral panels and we're going to move them over to a different area that the horses can eat in, and that area can grow up. Or you're fencing the horses into the sacrifice area so they can't eat the pasture around it. You're going to want to use things that are portable, and usually that's going to be portable corral panels or something like electric fence that's portable. So they sell like PVC posts or plastic posts that you just stick in the ground and string electric wire around it, and it keeps the horses in. It's not really a physical barrier. It's just more of a psychological barrier because the horses don't want to get shocked. All right, you want to control access to water sources. If the horses are going to use these water sources for drinking, or if you're going to use them for irrigation, you want to make sure the horses aren't contaminating the water by urinating in the water, defecating in the water, or dropping feed into the water. And so you would want to fence off those water sources, maybe allow where the horse can get their head in to drink. But horses will stand in water, and they will defecate and urinate in the water. So if you're using that water for consumption, you don't want them doing that. So fence the water off. You're going to have fences, so that means you need gates. And we have gates that lead between every single corral or pasture into the adjacent ones, so that we could drive in and out of every corral and pasture into the ones next to it if we needed to. So you want to strategically place those for good access control and movement of vehicles and horses. You want to make sure they're wide enough to get your vehicles through, especially in emergencies. You have a horse down in a pasture, you're going to have to drive trucks and equipment out there to get that horse. So if you're going to be having loafing sheds hauled in, equipment hauled in for construction, you want to make sure those gates are at least 16 feet wide. You want to ensure that they are secure and in good repair, and make sure horses can't open them. And also try to mitigate horses becoming injured on the gates, which is tough because horses can injure themselves on almost anything, but you want to minimize the risk as much as possible. So check for things like sharp edges, places where they can get their legs or hooves caught, anything that can scratch their skin, they can get caught on, their manes or tails can get caught in. Just check for things like that. So safety checks are important. You want to regularly inspect your fencing for any damage and promptly and properly repair it. So pictured here are portable corral panels next to a permanent pipe corral. So we look at this daily and make sure that that pipe is not rusted through, that it's not damaged in some way. We check the corral panels that they're still all attached, they're standing upright the way they should be, that none of the rungs have become broken or bent or damaged. We check our pasture fencing daily. You're checking the posts, you're checking the wires, you're just checking everything to make sure that it is in good repair, it is standing, it's where it's supposed to be, and the horses can't get hurt on it. All right, and that is a wrap. So we have discussed a lot: barn hygiene and ventilation, pasture management, water flow, fencing, and we've touched a little bit on social groupings of horses. This photo is when we first moved to our current location. We had to do a lot of fencing, and it's hard work. So at that time, we were using a post hole digger by hand and a handheld auger to dig our holes for setting our fence posts. But now we have a skid loader and it has an auger on it, so that makes things a lot easier lately. Well, I want to thank you very much for learning with me today. I want to remind you to always be kind and love your animals. And if you do need to contact me, you can email me at spiritkeeperequinesanctuary@gmail.com or just contact me through Unity Environmental University. Thank you so much, and a list of all of my resources follows.